This country vanished in less than 24 hours. No invasion, no final battle, no revolution in the streets. One day, it was one of the most powerful nations on Earth. The next day, it legally did not exist. This wasn't a small country. It was the Soviet Union, a superpower with thousands of nuclear weapons, a nation that had defeated Nazi Germany, a country so large that crossing it by train could take an entire week. And yet, after nearly 70 years of existence, it collapsed, almost silently. So how does a global superpower simply disappear? At its height, the Soviet Union covered nearly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. It stretched across 11 time zones, from Eastern Europe across Siberia all the way to the Pacific Ocean. More than 290 million people lived inside its borders. The Soviet Union controlled massive oil reserves, huge armies, and the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. For decades, it stood as the only true rival to the United States. This was the country that launched Sputnik, the country that sent the first human into space. Its military power shaped nearly every major global conflict during the Cold War. To millions around the world, the Soviet Union looked permanent, unshakable. But appearances can hide deeper problems. And by the 1980s, those problems were everywhere. The Soviet economy was slowing down. For decades, the government had tightly controlled nearly everything: factories, production prices, even agriculture. At first, this system helped industrialize the country rapidly, but over time, it became inefficient and outdated. Factories often cared more about meeting government quotas than producing quality goods. Innovation slowed, corruption spread, workers lost motivation. Meanwhile, the United States and Western Europe were advancing technologically at a much faster pace. Inside the Soviet Union, ordinary life became increasingly frustrating. Food shortages became common. People waited hours in line just to buy bread, milk, or basic household items. Store shelves often sat empty, and while citizens struggled, the government continued spending enormous amounts of money on the military and the arms race with America. The war in Afghanistan made things even worse. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979, expecting a quick victory. Instead, it became a long, expensive war that drained resources and damaged public confidence. Thousands of Soviet soldiers never came home. People began asking dangerous questions. If the Soviet system was so powerful, why was everyday life getting harder? In 1985, a new leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike previous Soviet leaders, Gorbachev understood that the system was in trouble. He introduced two major reforms: perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. Perestroika aimed to modernize the economy. Glasnost allowed people more freedom to speak openly about problems inside the country. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could criticize the government publicly. And that changed everything, because once people were allowed to speak honestly, they began talking about corruption, poverty, government failures, and historical crimes the state had hidden for years. The fear that had held the Soviet system together slowly began to disappear, and as censorship weakened, so did Moscow's control. 。 The Soviet Union was not just Russia. It was made up of 15 separate republics: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and many others. Many of these regions had their own languages, cultures, and national identities. For years, they had been ruled from Moscow. Now, they saw an opportunity to break free. The first major resistance came from the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Huge independence movements formed. In 1989, around 2 million people joined hands across the Baltic region in a massive protest known as the Baltic Way. The human chain stretched for hundreds of kilometers. It became one of the most powerful peaceful protests of the Cold War era. Soon, nationalist movements spread across the Soviet Union. The central government was losing authority, and the republics were becoming harder to control. By 1991, the Soviet Union was hanging by a thread. Hardline officials inside the government believed Gorbachev's reforms had gone too far. They feared the entire country was falling apart. So in August 1991, they launched a coup. Government officials and military leaders attempted to seize power while Gorbachev was isolated at his vacation home in Crimea. Tanks rolled into Moscow. The conspirators declared a state of emergency. For a moment, it looked like the Soviet Union might return to strict authoritarian rule. But something unexpected happened. Thousands of civilians flooded the streets in protest, and one man became the symbol of resistance: Boris Yeltsin. Standing on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament building, Yeltsin publicly denounced the coup. Images of that moment spread around the world. The coup collapsed within days, but the damage was irreversible. After that moment, the Soviet government no longer looked strong. It looked weak, divided, and vulnerable. Then came the meeting that changed history. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a forest retreat in Belarus. There was no national vote, no massive public announcement beforehand. Behind closed doors, they made a shocking decision. They signed what became known as the Belavesia Accords. The document declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Just like that, one signature ended one of the most powerful empires in modern history. Even Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, was essentially bypassed. The country he led was disappearing underneath him. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned on live television. That night, something symbolic happened at the Kremlin. The red Soviet flag, which had flown over the government for decades, was lowered for the final time. In its place, the Russian tricolor was raised. The next day, December 26th, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. No giant final battle, no dramatic last stand. A superpower simply ceased to exist. 15 independent countries suddenly appeared on the map. The Cold War was over. For millions of people, the collapse was deeply confusing. One day, they were Soviet citizens. The next day, they belonged to entirely different nations. New borders appeared overnight. Entire economies collapsed. Savings became worthless in some regions. Crime increased. Unemployment surged. Many former Soviet republics struggled through economic chaos. during the 1990s, and the political consequences are still shaping the world today. Modern conflicts involving Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and Eastern Europe all trace part of their origins back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even now, decades later, many people across the former USSR still debate whether the collapse was a tragedy or a liberation. History doesn't always end with explosions. Sometimes, the biggest events happen quietly. A meeting in a forest, a signature on a document, a flag lowered in silence, and overnight, one of the most powerful countries in human history disappeared forever.